Welcome to the Ernie Chambers Show.
Brothers, sisters, friends, enemies, and neutrals, I'm going to talk about what I was doing in the legislature to overcome being outnumbered and outgunned. You have to use your wits if you want to survive. And as the rabbit said, he runs a lot faster, cuts sharper than the fox because the fox is running for his dinner, but the rabbit's running for his life. So when you're in a hostile environment like I was in that legislature, there was no way to survive if you're just going to try to go along to get along. And I didn't go down there to get along. I went down there to do a job. So I brought some things that I'm going to read. When I talk about myself, I like to document it, and I'll give the newspaper and the date so that anybody who wants to cross-check is able to do so. I'm going to start by mentioning and briefly going into the first time that I became the longest serving member of the Nebraska Legislature. So rather than explain it, I'm going to read it. And this is dated April 17th, 2005. Chambers nears milestone. The legislature's senior senator this week will pass Warner's longevity mark. And I have a follow-up article regarding what happened during the first session that I returned. Now, this is what the reporter wrote. His lilting voice drifts into the Capitol corridors from office television sets tuned to the legislature. Mr. President, let me tell you how strong the union is now. The union is as strong as soup made from the shadow of a malnourished pigeon. That's how strong the union is. And as you can gather, my point was to show how weak, in fact, they had become. Business rings the dinner bell. The senators come running. The working people can't buy dinner. They can't take you out to the Nebraska Club or that big old hotel downtown, or give you membership in the country club, or take you out to play golf, because they work. Ernie Chambers said that on March 22nd, 2005, opposing changes in the state's unemployment insurance benefits. There was a constant struggle to do what you could to help ordinary people be treated like ordinary human beings, given the respect they're entitled to, a fair wage when they give an honest day's work. And it was constantly a battle to achieve those very simple basics. It is a familiar melody, mocking the powerful, detailing injustices, quoting philosophers, poets, and the Bible, as I call it. And we have been listening for close to 35 years. This week, the senator from Omaha will set a record, having served more time in the Nebraska legislature than any senator in history. The former record holder, Jerome Warner, had served almost 34 and a half years when he died April 20th, 1997. When Senator Ernie Chambers is term limited out of office in 3 years, he will have served 38 years in the State House. Unless term limits are repealed, that record will never be broken. Chambers himself is unimpressed with this record. Quote, "What does it mean? Not much. It just means that I persevered, endured, and survived here longer than anyone else. But the man who believes white Nebraskans approved term limits to get him out of the legislature enjoys the irony. Term limits will enshrine his place in history forever. And when I want to mock them, I'll tell them that all you did was memorialized me in your Constitution. The Constitution is the organic or basic law. It's the foundation on which all other laws are built. And you placed me at that level due to your hatred of me. Continuing. Although likely the most well-known Nebraska politician, Chambers reveals very little of his private life. They mentioned that I was a barber, which I never shied away from. It was an honest living. I had a chance to meet a lot of people on weekends and around holidays. There were things we could do for women who brought their little boys in and really didn't have the money to get all of them a haircut. We would just kind of do what little we could. He earned a law degree at Creighton University, but refuses to take the bar exam because he does not believe he should have to belong to an organization and pay dues to practice the profession for which he trained. Chambers ran for the legislature to unseat a senator who said on the floor, quote, "If it was God's plan for the white man to be in command, then there's nothing we can do about it." And he added later on, except go along with it. Naturally, I never believed that. Chambers came to the Capitol ignorant of how the legislature operated. I knew nothing about it. I didn't even know how many senators there were altogether. But he brought his militant rhetoric to Lincoln and was soon using his office to express his rage against injustices done to Blacks and other minorities, all people. But you know, in America, you have to find a way to label somebody, to pigeonhole somebody. So by using the term minority or pluralizing it to minorities, you could get away from having to make a distinction among the individuals who make up those so-called minorities. They were just an amorphous, undifferentiated mass, like if you're going to make dough, not money, but dough for a pizza or whatever you're going to make it for. It's just a mass. Ernie brings a body of experience and a willingness to give a very unvarnished view of the dominant culture from a minority perspective, said Lincoln Senator David Landis. Quote, "My experience is that for a large number of people, the last explanation of behavior is racism. And for Ernie, it may be the first explanation. He brings that kind of awareness to every field and every committee. Since he took office in 1971, Chambers has moved from a brash young man to a brash older man with the same clear focus. As Popeye says, I am what I am, that's all that I am, and it's all that I'll ever be. By the way, my 85th birthday was Sunday, and I don't feel a day over 84. Quote, I believe in doing what's right, and what's right in my view is seeing that people are not bullied or mistreated because they're weak and friendless. And the thing that guides me in treating other people a certain way is that I know how I want to be treated. And his own list of accomplishments are true to his self-appointed label, defender of the downtrodden. 1, plucking the mentally retarded and juveniles out of the hands of the executioner. Laws that prohibited the death penalty for juveniles and people with mental retardation. Believe it or not, before I came, that could be done. And then a few years afterward, the US Supreme Court did the same thing. So I was ahead of the top court in this country. Another item, getting rid of corporal punishment in the schools. White people, Negroes, and even churches said that paddling, as they called it, if you saw the paddles about 1.5 inches thick, that wide, and about, as the people say, yay long, that they would hit our children with. There was a guy named Barbee who was the principal at Horace Mann, I call it the Monster Factory. He loved to make little girls bend over and put their dress up and hit them on their panties. That's the kind of stuff being done to our children, and it was supposed to be all right. It was unacceptable to me. I went to school board meetings, they wouldn't do anything. The teachers union supported it. Black churches, well, Negro churches, Negro preachers supported it, but I did not. We were beaten worse than animals from the time we came into this country, and some people felt that should continue, but I didn't. At last, I got into a position where I could do something about it, and I eliminated it from all of the public schools. Striking the first blow that led to the fall of apartheid in South Africa, the Nebraska Legislature passed the first resolution calling for divestiture of U.S. investments from South Africa under apartheid in 1980. And their largest newspaper, the Rand Daily Mail, pointed out how concerned they were that the passage of such a legislative proposal in a Midwestern state could start a bandwagon effect. And that's what it did. And not only did it lead to the fall of apartheid, it resulted in my being invited to address the United Nations Committee to abolish apartheid. And it was this huge room, all these people sitting out there. We were on a raised platform in the back, sitting behind a desk. And I guess the headphones allowed whoever was speaking to have his or her words translated into the language of whoever wore the headphones for that particular language. And pretty soon, people were turning around, looking, because I pointed out the similarity between slavery in America and the racism that still existed and the apartheid which existed in South Africa. Cheap labor, inhumane conditions, and the right of people to do what was ever necessary to throw off an oppressor and obtain their freedom. And naturally, there were some newspaper people, so there's news coverage of that visit. Correcting an unfair pension system in which women received a lesser amount than men. Can you believe that before I got there, and most of the white women, most of the women who worked for the state were white. There might have been some janitresses, but most of them were white, and white men whose mothers were white, whose daughters were white, put together a system where white working women paid the same amount out of their salary into the pension fund from which money was derived to pay pension money to those who retired. Well, arguing that women live longer, even though they paid the same amount of money in, they couldn't get the same amount of money out. Well, I went against that, and the one who brought it to my attention was Cynthia Granberry, who was working for me, and she was going to law school at that time and became aware of this, and I told her, I don't believe it. That couldn't be, but it was. It was obviously gender discrimination, but to make a long story short, when I brought the legislation, it was resisted on the floor of the legislature, and I had to embarrass these white men by telling them that you can say a woman lives longer than you, but not every woman lives longer than every man. When she goes to the store, they don't charge her less for a product than they charge you because she doesn't get as large a payout. I shouldn't have had to even get to those kind of basic levels, but I did. And it showed me what I was working with and the kind of people in that legislature. So I knew what I had to do. My work was cut out for me. Continuing. Chambers first tried the traditional route to power through the committee chairmanship. He was chairman of the Government, Military and Veterans Affairs Committee for 2 years early in his career. But after fellow senators several times rejected his bid for chairman of the Judiciary Committee, he created his own path. He combines a mastery of the rules, his powerful intellect, and his love of language to stop bills he doesn't like. In the early years, Chambers worked with other senators on successful legislation, including repeal of the death penalty. People didn't know how I had achieved that, but then Governor Thone vetoed it. District elections for the Omaha City Council and the school board. My city council bill was vetoed 3 times by the governor. And the 4th time he vetoed it, I was able to override his veto. That's how I got district elections. And for the first time, Black people were able to get a seat on the council. That means instead of you running against everybody in the city and the top finishers get the number of seats available, they divided the city into districts and each one could send a representative of their choice. And my argument was that any governing body should be a portraiture in miniature of the populace to be represented. Since there never was a Black person on the city council, we never had representation, and the kind of ordinances they passed, the kind they refused to pass, demonstrated the contempt that they have for us. And I did go to city council meetings as a youngster and face them down, the bear in his lair. So they knew of me, and they knew I didn't have fear, that I would be prepared, that being outnumbered by more white men than you can shake a stick at or lay a stick on made me no difference. I often went everywhere I went alone because I had that vision and other people didn't. So the obligation was on me because I saw it. If other people didn't see it, they couldn't behave the way that I did. Anyway, the school board, we didn't have Black people on the school board. One time somebody was appointed, I think. Another time some nice guy was put on what they call the orange ticket. However many seats were open, that many people got together, the names were put on an orange ticket. The school teachers union and everybody who wanted to have the school board, I guess, structured the way they wanted to, would vote the orange ticket. If a Black person didn't get on the orange ticket, there's no way he or she could get on that board. Once I got district elections, several times that bill was vetoed. Then we started electing people of our choice to the school board. They didn't always do what they should have done, but at least we had, as a community, the opportunity to try to find people who would do the job. Today, he dominates by stealing time, threatening bills with hours of amendments, and I would carry out what I said I would do. Quote, "He has sometimes described himself as the gatekeeper," said Lincoln Senator Chris Beitler. "He is the best defensive player in the legislature. He is extremely adept at using the rules to kill or to wound." Beitler later became the mayor of Lincoln. Chambers is alternately gracious and outrageous. He creates his own mocking vocabulary, Republicans for Republicans, demagogues for Democrats, the Bible for the Bible, which he quotes often. And he is the King Cobra, brushing aside a bill not worthy of his time with the mantra, "The King Cobra wastes no venom on dead things." And I would add, or fleeing things. He's extremely adept at pushing the legislature to its limits in terms of tolerance, said Beitler. He's also become more sophisticated, sometimes getting his way in exchange for his silence. For example, and this is something that people didn't know, that I was the first one to get done in legislature, and I had some white gay people in a building on 24th and Lake put an insulting sign in their window using the N word. And I went down there to be in a demonstration because Levon Stennis let some of us know. And I was down there and I was mentioning how insulting and degrading it was. And this woman said it was supposed to be. And so I went off, no profanity. And then some of her little gay friends came around and they didn't know that I was the first one and the only one That leads me up to this sentence. For example, in exchange for not holding up a bill he was attacking, Chambers got an amendment banning discrimination for sexual orientation, Beitler pointed out. That's what I did. See, I get attacked by these racist people. Oh, you didn't think gay people could be racist? Are they white? That's what I saw first. But it didn't turn me against somebody as far as mistreating them. It let me know that they take in racism with their mother's milk if they were nursed. They learn it at home, at school, at play, at church, everywhere. So I didn't care what their side orientations were. The first thing, these are white people, and they're going to behave toward us like white people. And the fact that they put that sign in the window with the N word on it showed me what racist they were. And I don't care what their sexual orientation was. But I'll tell you this too. The fact that one gay person is a racist doesn't make me think all of them are in terms of their behavior. But I believe they all have racism in them. How could they not have? This country is awash in racism. I could have fixed them if I wanted to by making sure nothing was ever passed by the legislature that would make it unlawful to discriminate against somebody based on sexual orientation. And ultimately it became the law, a general law. Nicole, a white toy poodle, fiercely guards his cavernous office. Every flat surface covered with files and books. Nicole belongs to Chambers' legislative aide, Cynthia Granberry, but she also perches protectively on the senator's lap as he answers questions about his encyclopedic knowledge and his love of language. Quote, "It was difficult for me to master the alphabet and words. So when I mastered them, I was so fascinated, it was almost magical. I would read everything I could get my hands on. I couldn't sit down at the table and eat without reading. If I had a candy bar, I'd read the wrapper." Chambers talks about the lost my place. Chambers talks, and I don't want to ad lib when I'm supposed to be reading. Chambers talks about the poems he writes. He calls them rhymes and distributes to his colleagues. Quote, "Words have a life of their own. I have to dominate them and bend them to my will. And the best way I can do that is to write in meter and in rhyme. That's when you've got control over words and language." Then this is a quote from me. "You know how they kill the fox in England? The dogs tear that little animal to bits. That is sportsman's attitude, white sportsman so-called. A little animal that could not fight off one hound has to fight off a pack of them. And they like to chase foxes because they have what's called a hot scent, and the dogs can easily track them down. And this was the sport of the better classes. And I guess by chasing down foxes, they didn't chase down the poor people in England, but the poor people in England couldn't run fast enough, and dogs probably didn't have a taste for them." Continuing, "I identify with the fox. Down here, I'm constantly being pursued by the pack. My people in this country always face the mob. They wouldn't come after us with one man. They always had to bring a mob to come and get one of us. And they had to violate their own laws and constitution to do it, which is what they do now. That's why a white man's word means nothing. They look good on paper, but they don't mean anything. And Donald Trump, the fool, demonstrated how fragile this so-called nation of laws really is. We follow the law. I follow the rules. Don't get at me. And if you change the rules, I'll master those and I'll whip you with those. You are the ones who talk about law and order. Well, you write the law and I will impose the order." That's what I could say to these white people. One young black man outnumbered by 48 and talking to these white people in that arrogant, uppity way. didn't know my place, wouldn't scratch when I didn't itch, wouldn't grin when nothing was funny, wouldn't drop my eyes and not look a white man in his eyes. Why, the nerve of this young black man, although you know that they had something else in mind, but they didn't dare say any of those things to me. And by the way, I did lift weights and I was in much better shape then than I am now. And I had slabs of iron, I mean slabs, that thick, that big around, 35-pound plates and 50-pound plates, and a weight bench in the office. And I'd get under those weights and give interviews while I'm pumping the iron. I would do one arm alternate curls with dumbbells, 40 pounds. And I didn't weigh anywhere near what they did. But as I would say, a small piece of leather, but well put together. But I didn't bully anybody, and I wasn't going to let anybody bully me. By the way, I never carried a knife, never carried a gun, never used a weapon on anybody, never threatened anybody with a weapon. And wherever I felt I had to go, that's where I went. And even though there were threats made of what would happen to me, they would just have to show me. There was a song, one of the lines, or a few of them, it was about this woman. You came here from the Middle West. You certainly impressed the population hereabouts. But baby, I got news for you. I'm from St. Louis too. So naturally, I got my doubts. You want to be shown, and you got to show me. Do I think I can whip everybody in the world? I might couldn't lick my lips, but I wouldn't go down without a fight. And there were people who didn't want to test me to see what I knew or didn't know. A couple of times I went out to one of those places where you can lift weights, and there are all these people lifting weights, and the amount of weight that I was lifting caused some to come and stand around, and they would want to tell me how to lift. And I said, well, why don't you show me? They said, oh, I can't lift that much. I said, so then you who can't do what I can do is going to tell me how to do better what I do? I think I will stick with the way that I do it. And while I was talking, I was lifting, not to show off, not to intimidate anybody, but to be left alone. That comment about you write the law and I impose the order was when I successfully defeated an attempt for them to put an issue on the ballot to enshrine hunting, trapping, and fishing in the Constitution, and they couldn't do it until after I left. And now your Constitution talks about the right protected by law and a right given by God to hunt, trap, and fish, and to keep and bear arms. They couldn't even get that trash through the legislature by way of a vote because I tried to keep their Constitution pure. That's not the kind of thing that ought to be in the Constitution. And if they knew history, they would be aware that their forebears, way back in the 1800s, wanted to put, well, 1700s, they wanted to put into the Constitution protection of hunting, trapping, and fishing, and they were mocked and laughed to scorn. One said, well, while we're doing it, we should put in a guarantee that when you're in the wintertime, after you slept on the right side and the left side being exposed got cold, you had a constitutional right to roll over and lie on the left side to warm it up. And then when the right side got cold, you could roll back over again. And they gave other simple-minded examples to show how stupid it was, but that's what white people do when somebody intelligent is not around there to save them from themselves. What others say about Ernie. Senator Chambers seldom plays a losing hand. Top lobbyist Walt Radcliffe. He is traffic control, said lobbyist Rich Lombardi. More members now do regard him as the dean of the legislature and look to him for advice, said Senator Diana Shimmick. He's been remarkably consistent in the substantive positions, but he's become more sophisticated in using the rules, Lincoln Senator Chris Beitler. And by the way, the wonderful thing about this gadget that you're watching this on, you can turn it off whenever you want to, I understand. So that was written to talk about the time that I was going to pass Senator Warner and became the longest serving member of the legislature. This was written after I had sat out 4 years, because after you serve 2 years back to back and sit out a 4-year term, you can come back again, and that's what I did. So when I came back, that was in January of 2013, and this is what was written at the end of that first session. Chambers returns, does not disappoint. Omaha Senator Ernie Chambers returned to the Nebraska Legislature in January and kept his promises. He educated, he frustrated, he sermonized, he lectured. Quote, Daddy Warbucks doesn't need you, little orphan Annie does, but you always kowtow to Daddy Warbucks, unquote. He defined daily unpredictability. He lit up the lexicon, labeling factions of his fellow senators as cliquites, clackites, troglodytes, referring to pinhead states and pipsqueak public officials, and explaining that I could make better backbones out of jello than the kind they had in their spine. He challenged, quote, I get sick and tired of all these hypocrites running around and talking about the federal government is too big. Reduce the size of government, talking about white people. And you hear that now. Then who do they go to with their hands stuck out all of the time? If there's a drought in Nebraska, who are they going to go to? Not Ghostbusters, not to the Tea Party, but to that big old government they hate and whose size they want to reduce, because they think in cliches, they speak in slogans, and there's no real mental activity going on in that vital organ known as the brain. That most magnificent, mysterious lump of flesh. Anyway, early in the session, some senators who never had experienced the Ernie Chambers way, because for 4 years, remember, I wasn't there, so no new people came in. They were accustomed to quick debates and a fast-moving agenda. They ran to Speaker Greg Adams demanding he take control of Chambers and stop his long-winded speeches. Don't that beat all? Quote, those who know Ernie know nobody controls Ernie, said Speaker Adams. The speaker waited and watched. And it wasn't long before those senators who wanted to shut him up on one issue were yielding him time on another. Quote, I reminded those people, see how this works, Adams said. He frequently sang from the session soundtrack. I can't carry a tune in a bucket, but every now and then I want to make people miserable. When I'm sad, I sing and make everybody sad with me. You've got to give a little, take a little, and let your poor heart break a little. That's the story of, that's the end glory of the political process. The middle of the session bogged down, some believe, in part because of Chambers' concern about the local option sales tax that passed in 2012 in his absence, and the potential that low-income constituents would have to pay more in taxes once cities voted in that plan. It was an option because the state didn't impose the sales tax, but gave the city the authority to do it. As soon as I came back and became aware of that, I wouldn't let legislation move. Then Brad Ashford, who died a few months ago and was in the legislature at that time, told people that Ernie's upset about that local option tax, and we're not going to get anything done around here until we do something about it. That had to be resolved, Omaha Senator Brad Ashford said. And when it was, that unclogged the session. You know what was done? They repealed that law. You all didn't know that. You may not have even known the law was in place. My job was to do my job, whether anybody knew it or not, whether anybody respected it or not. It wasn't done to please people. It was to carry out the promise I made when I gave that affirmation that I would discharge the duties of that office to the best of my ability. And that's what I did. And it was considerably more ability, as it turned out, than 48 other people put together. Ashford said, he doesn't ask this body to do a whole lot. He doesn't introduce a lot of bills. His main function is to work with the bills that are introduced by others, to point out their weaknesses, to change and improve what he can, and to kill what needs to die. From Chambers, I might push people to the edge of the cliff, but I won't push them over unless it's necessary. Chambers said, he returned to the Capitol because he could not let his legislative career end by being bounced out of office by voters who didn't like him and who didn't live in his district. They could change the state constitution by adding term limits, but they couldn't keep him out, he said. On his return, he found the legislature to be more fractured. Quote, there was more cohesiveness before among those who were backward, Chambers said. Chambers first came to the legislature in his 30s. While he was angry at times and still is, he never was motivated by anger. He said it consumes too much energy. Anger, the way I look at it, is a feeling of such indignation and outrage about something that doesn't have to be that way, that you're going to speak against it, then you're going to find a way to work against it and correct it if you can. If he could go back and advise that young Black man living in North Omaha, he said he wouldn't try to alter his course in the least. He would let his life unfold just the way it has. On second thought, there is one thing he would tell that young Ernie Chambers. When you go to a store that sells those short sleeve sweatshirts, buy 100 of them because they're not going to always make them. That's the regret. Now, here was a woman who came to the legislature, but didn't know for sure how I operated. So here's what was written. Another common Chambers tactic is to set up deliberate questions that force legislators to agree with an argument he's trying to prove. Some humbly succumb. Others avoid the trap by not answering, as Senator Hudkins of Malcolm did earlier this session during debate on a trivial bill to designate a state fish and crop. And I was against that silliness, putting that stuff in law. But anyway, Hudkins told Chambers, quote, I was told a long time ago never to engage in a debate because you would ask us questions where if you agree to A, which is obvious, and you agree to B, which is obvious, then you have to agree to C. And if you agree to C, that shows what a nut you are. That's what's known as a syllogism, a major premise, a minor premise. And if those two are true, the conclusion is inescapable. The major premise is a general statement, then a specific statement. For example, all men are mortal. Martin Luther King is a man. Therefore, Martin Luther King is mortal. The conclusion flows from that generalization. But I knew how to use language in a way that this woman found out about, and she wouldn't answer questions. Warner, who at that time was the longest serving senator, chuckles as he recalls freshman senators who time and again think they can beat Chambers at his own game. They think they know how to handle Ernie, Warner said. Without exception, number one, they don't, and number two, they usually end up defending him. Some of them, when they get an understanding, change their conduct. And that's what I had to push for. But whether they did or not, I would not stop pushing because my obligation to do as I did was not based on how successful it was in terms of persuading other people to do it. My definition of success for me was not that the result I was seeking would always be arrived at, but if I did the best that I could under the circumstances, I was successful for me. And I was the only one I had to live with and please. But Chambers insists that if there's full discussion on an issue, he will not speak. Other times, he is alone in his arguments. There are a lot of matters such as the death penalty, same-sex marriages, physician-assisted dying, where I will be virtually the only voice, he said. If I don't deal with those issues, nobody will. But the fact that I knew people wouldn't didn't stop me. Here's an article. Chambers takes aim at opponents' bills. These are designed to give an idea from factual sources what I actually did in the legislature, which a lot of people don't know, and they'd be at, what do you do down there? What does he do down there? What has he ever done? Chambers takes aim at opponents' bill. Here's what I do when I read the Bible. I liked a story. Jesus was always trying to persuade Jews that he was the Son of God and they should change their wicked ways, and they were offended because here's a ragtag bobtail guy from out of nowhere. His daddy was a carpenter. They knew his brothers and sisters, and they didn't amount to much either. And when Jesus worked in the carpenter shop, a famous verse came from that work in the barber shop. I mean, in the carpenter shop. And it's the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus swept. And somebody said, that's not Jesus swept, it's Jesus wept. I said, see, that teaches you that you have to not only rightly divide the word of truth, you have to rightly divide the words you say. Because to somebody who heard you say, Jesus wept, they didn't think of Jesus as a ball baby. So they think it referred to when he was working in the carpenter shop and he swept the floor. Trying to explain people, not embarrass them for the sake of embarrassing them, but they had to listen and understand what was being said. That's a hard job. But anyway, let me go on with, the Trinity was something that the Bible was full of in the New Testament. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Somebody else might say the Father, the Son, and that other one. The kids might say Daddy-o, Laddie-o, and Spook. And there was a song that said, the three men I admire the most, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, caught the last train for the coast. Today the music died. So they were fascinated with the Trinity. There were some words Jesus said at the end, a trinity of trinities. How many threes are there in 9? Forgive them, for they know not what they do. 9 words, 3 trinities. And the very last statement he made, it is finished. There was a centurion, and he had a sick servant, and he told Jesus, because he'd watched him, the centurion is a Roman. They're practical, down to earth. I have a servant and he's sick, and I want you to heal him. And Jesus looked at these Jews as he always did and said, I haven't seen so much faith in all of Israel. Take me to your servant and I'll heal him. And the centurion said, I'm a man set under authority. I say to this one, go, and he goes. I say to that one, come, and he comes. All you have to do is give the word and he'll be healed. And Jesus again said, he had not seen such faith in Israel. Pilate was a Roman, and I had mentioned the fact that he had a wife, and the Bible tells you, because she told him, have not thou anything to do with this just man, for I've suffered much in a dream because of him. Well, when Pilate found out where Jesus came from, there was a tetrarch, or whatever they called him. His name was Herod, and he was over the jurisdiction where Jesus came from. Well, Jesus was a problematical matter for Pilate. Pilate didn't want to see him killed, so he sent him to Herod to deal with him. And Herod heard about him, wanted him to do some miracles. Well, Jesus was not a sideshow trickster, a magician, and he wouldn't even speak. So they knocked him around and sent him back to Pilate, said, it's your job to deal with him. So Pilate's trying to figure, how in the world can I save this little fellow? He hasn't done anything. He doesn't agree with these crazy Jews believing, well, I don't think they make sense anyway. But when Rome took over an area, to the extent they could, without undermining their rule, they let the people there follow as many of their customs as they wanted to. So at the Feast of the Passover, and that is based on a mythical story, there was a time way back in the MISTS of the past when the death angel was going to come down and slay Egyptians because they had enslaved the Hebrews. But the Hebrews were given a secret. If you took this hyssop and dipped it in blood and put a mark over the door, you were safe. Whenever the death angel saw that, then the death angel would pass over and not kill. So that was one of their important feasts. They were having a Passover ceremony, and there was a custom they had. One person doomed to die could be spared. Pilate thought Jesus should be spared because he hadn't done anything. He tried to talk sense into these people, and they wouldn't listen to him. And nothing he said was any crazier than they said. He said he's a son of God. So what? In Rome, there are a lot of gods. Didn't make any difference. So in order to try to save Jesus, 5 feet 9 inches tall, 135 pounds, soaking wet, before he took him out there to let him look at him, he had them take this scourge, this little whip, and drop his robe from his shoulders and lash him so there'd be some blood on his clothes, then put thorns on his head because he's supposed to be a king, and took him out there and stood him on this balcony in front of all these people. Then they brought this vicious, horrible guy named Barabbas. He growled. Everybody was afraid of him. He was an insurrectionist, 6'6", 280 pounds, solid muscle. And he had a scar that went across from his left eyebrow down across the bridge of his nose, across his left cheek, and on down, and cut his neck, but it didn't get that jugular. So here he is. And Pilate had 3 men to hold him with chains, one on the left, one on the right, and one behind him with a metal collar. And they were holding him, and he pulling and jerking and growling and spitting and snorting, snot coming out of his nose. And Pilate looked out over the crowd who were there for their religious observation. And Pilate said, which one of these men do you want? And he knew that they'd have to take Jesus. And they said, the crowd looked, they didn't know what to say because they'd never seen a spectacle like this. So the priests and the rabbis said, give us Barabbas. And being like a lynch mob, the crowd echoed, give us Barabbas. And Pilate couldn't believe his ears. He said, Barabbas? Well, what should I do with Jesus? And they didn't know what to say because they're ignorant. Hitler said that if you're going to use propaganda, you have to gear it to the lowest level of intelligence, and the biggest lie will be believed if you repeat it long enough and often enough. But you have to bring your propaganda down to those on the lowest level. So the people didn't know what to say. They didn't look for that question. So again, the religious people said, crucify him. And the multitude echoed, crucify him. But before they got to that, and Pilate was asking them, what should I do with Jesus? He had written something that said, King of the Jews. And he said, you want Barabbas? Then what should I do with your king? And that's when they said, crucify him. And he said, crucify your king. And they said, don't say he's our king. Say he said he's our king. And Pilate, show his contempt. You're dealing with a Roman now. What I have written, I have written. So he put King of the Jews at the top of the cross. And because crucifixion was supposed to be a degrading punishment, Jesus had to, the one to be crucified, had to drag his own cross. So Jesus had been beaten. He was bloody and probably hadn't eaten. And Pilate, before he sent him, he said, man, look, I did all I could to save your life. Your own people are doing this. I can't do anything else. The law of Rome governs me. The law of your and their God is going to make this Roman do this thing that the Roman doesn't want to do. So Jesus had to struggle under that cross, and he'd stumble and fall. And then there was a crowd on one side of the road and a crowd on the other side, and Jesus was walking among them, dragging the cross. And then there was a little hubbub, and people wondered what it was. So they looked around, and coming through the crowd, and the crowd separated like the Red Sea did when Moses was going to take the children of Israel out of Egypt. And here was this big, muscular black man, Simon the Cyrenian. And he pushed these Jews out of the way. And he made, threw his lot in with this man who had been deemed a criminal of the worst and lowest order, unfit to live. And he said, little fella, I can't save you life, but I can save you some humiliation. So he took the cross on his shoulder, wrapped his other arm around Jesus, and half dragged him, half carried him to the place where they were going to execute him. They laid out the cross, laid him on it, drove spikes through his hands, and because the body is too heavy for that, the flesh in the hands to hold the body, they put a footrest. So his feet would rest on this footrest, and he would be nailed on the cross, but he wasn't hanging like people say. But if they had chosen to drive the nails through and then wrap cords around his wrist to hold him, then he would still die slowly, because all the blood would drain down to the lower parts of his body. His heart pretty soon wouldn't have enough force to push the blood, and it goes down and comes all the way back up, and he died from heart failure. So in this case, Jesus wasn't going to die that way, but he was having a slow, painful death. So a centurion came and stuck a spear in his side. And people who read the Bible say, boy, that was very cruel. But I read it differently. I read it differently. To me, that was the centurion whose servant Jesus had healed. And he didn't want Jesus to die a long time. 10 minutes? Didn't want Jesus to take that long. So when he put the spear in him, it was to kill Jesus quicker. But Jesus still hung on. And then it said that one took a sponge, because Jesus said, I thirst, and gave it up to him. And the Bible says it had vinegar. And some people say that's how cruel the Romans are. Well, I've been told that this was really like a narcotic, and it was translated vinegar, but it was a painkiller. So that could have been the centurion whose servant Jesus healed. And the centurion, since he couldn't make him die quicker, tried to take some of the pain and suffering out of his dying. That's the way I read it. You can read that and interpret it the way you want to, and I interpret it my way. So then something strange happened. A trinity of words, again, from Jesus. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Another trinity of words. And then the last trinity of words, when he gave up the ghost, it is finished. So forgive them, for they know not what they do. 9. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? 9. It is finished. 3 more. But what about all this talk that Jesus and God are one? If that's true, then Jesus would be crazy. He would be saying, myself, why have I forsaken myself? Something's not right in this. When he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he was there to do what he had come down here to do based on the way they interpret those myths and rumors in the Bible. And when the load was too heavy for him emotionally to bear, taking all the sins that had been committed by all the human beings on the face of the earth throughout all of the time that they've been on there, you know, that's a heavy load. And so Jesus said, and his sweat like drops of blood came down. He said, if possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, because he knew what he was there for, not my will, but thine be done. Well, he's talking to somebody. Or was he crazy? And once again, he was hallucinating. If possible, I will not drink this cup, but that's not what the Bible said. He was talking to somebody or something. If possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. Thine doesn't refer to the person speaking. It's the one being spoken to. It's the second person pronoun. First person is the speaker. Second person is the one spoken to. Third person would be the one spoken about. That's a little grammar lesson. So now the time has come to say to you, I bid you adieu. As the, you know what I'm going to say? As the canary said when he was told that the door to his cage was ajar, I'm out of here.
Thank you for watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to make suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This has been an EWC Communication production.